I suppose I never meant for any of it to happen. I look back now, tracing the lines of my own choices, but I can't say with certainty where the first misstep was made. Perhaps it was the loneliness, the silence that filled my home after Mark was gone. Or maybe it was my own longing for something different, something illicit. Something that didn't make sense for a woman my age. But how could I have known the consequences that would follow? This isn't one of those stories that begins with a neat little beginning, where a widow suddenly falls headlong into something she can't control. No, it's murkier than that. People see what they want to see, but they never look closely enough to see what lies beneath, until it's too late. I didn't know, at least not at first, that the steps I took would lead me into a labyrinth of whispered threats, guilt, and fear, the kind of things that curl around you like smoke and make you wonder if you're still breathing freely. Two young men live next door. Darius and Moloch. Names I once thought of casually, faces that were barely more than passing shadows in my world of Sunday morning errands and wine on Tuesday nights. But one day, the walls of our ordinary lives overlapped, and they began to push through the cracks in ways I couldn't anticipate. They were neighbors, mere acquaintances in passing, but soon enough, they became something else entirely. There's a difference between curiosity and compulsion, between a glimpse and a descent. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when everything changed, but I know it had something to do with that first encounter. The glances we exchanged, harmless enough at first, until they weren't. The quiet thrill was addictive. I'm not proud of it, nor am I ashamed. No, not anymore. But if I'm to tell this story, if I'm to lay it all out, then I should warn you, it doesn't end the way you might expect. The nights grew darker, secrets bled into other secrets, and soon enough, I wasn't sure if I could even trust myself anymore. There were hints, shadows of something darker still, lurking behind those charming smiles and easygoing conversations. But it wasn't until the warnings started that I began to understand. And by then, of course, it was already too late. The first time I noticed Darius and Malik, I'd been coming home from a weekly book club meeting. It was late afternoon, one of those golden, fading hours that washed everything in a surreal glow. They were standing near the mailbox outside their house, speaking in low tones. I'd seen them in passing, of course, but that day, something about them felt different. As if they'd been waiting for me to walk by. "Afternoon, Miss Winslow," Darius had said, offering me a smile that was both easy and somehow challenging. He had that kind of smile, the sort that made you question his intentions, and the sort that probably got him in trouble often enough to know better. "Good afternoon, boys," I replied, keeping my tone light, casual. I'd been living here for almost 20 years and knew most of my neighbors well enough. But Darius and Moloch were different. A little distant, a little too self-assured for their age. Darius worked odd jobs here and there, I'd heard, though exactly what those jobs were remained a mystery. Moloch was quieter, reserved. He was tall, with a thoughtful, almost brooding expression that made him look far older than he was. He glanced up, nodded, and quickly looked away. It was the first time I'd felt that lingering sense of curiosity. They were young. No more than 24 or 25, I thought, but there was something about them that stayed with me after I walked away. Their intensity, their ease with themselves, struck a chord I didn't expect. I shook it off. A passing thought, a harmless observation, or so I told myself. But then, it didn't stay harmless. A week or so later, I ran into Moloch at the grocery store. I'd gone early, hoping to avoid the crowds, and there he was examining a display of wine bottles, looking just as out of place as I felt. "Moloch," I greeted him with a warm smile, watching as he blinked, surprised to see me. "Miss Winslow," he replied, with that quiet nod of his. His voice was soft, almost disarming, and I found myself wanting to know more, to peel back whatever layer of reserve he held so tightly to his chest. "What brings you out so early?" He shrugged, glancing down at the bottle he was holding. I work late most nights. This is my morning. We ended up talking for a few minutes longer than I'd intended, standing by the wine aisle, discussing everything and nothing. I learned he worked at a bar downtown, a place I'd heard of but never visited. He asked about me, my interests, and the empty spaces in my life began to feel just a little fuller. It wasn't anything improper, not yet, but that line, that delicate line, felt closer than it ever had before. As I left the store, I realized I'd bought the same wine he'd been holding. The following weeks saw a series of small, seemingly insignificant moments. A nod from Darius as he passed me on the street, a wave from Malik in the distance. Each interaction felt charged, filled with an unspoken promise that lingered in my mind long after they'd ended. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, something dormant reawakened. The thrill was undeniable, and each time, the encounters chipped away at my better judgment. One late afternoon, I saw them standing together in their front yard, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Impulsively, I walked over, pretending to ask if they needed help with their garden, though I knew they didn't. Darius grinned at me in that way he always did. Mischievous, almost daring. Malik watched us, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. It became a routine, small encounters that grew longer each time. I told myself they were just friendly, harmless. But each interaction felt like I was inching closer to a cliff's edge. Then one evening, I invited them over for a glass of wine. It was innocent enough, just a neighborly gesture, I told myself. The three of us sat in my living room, the bottle of wine between us, the air thick with a tension I tried not to acknowledge. Darius was the one who kept the conversation flowing, his laughter filling the room, bright and uninhibited. Malik was quieter, his gaze wandering around my home, taking in the shelves lined with books, the artifacts I'd collected from a lifetime of museum work. He asked about my past, about the life I'd led, and with each question, I found myself revealing more, feeling seen in a way I hadn't in years. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, after I'd described my last exhibit. "All that history, all those stories?" "I miss it every day," I replied, and the honesty of it startled me. For years I'd played the part of the content widow, keeping up appearances. But there, in that dim room with two young men who were practically strangers, I found myself being truthful in a way that felt raw and freeing. Darius leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe you just need something new. A change." The words hung between us, charged, layered, and in that moment, I knew something had shifted. My world was still, suspended in that moment, and there was no going back. The days that followed were filled with a strange anticipation. I was waiting for something I couldn't name. I would glance out my window, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, feeling a thrill when I did, and a pang of disappointment when I didn't. It was an impulse I couldn't control, a need that gnawed at me, hollowing out whatever sense of propriety I still clung to. But there was guilt, too. Every time I walked past the family photos that lined my hallway, memories of Mark surfaced, our years together, his steady presence, the way he'd looked at me with complete trust. And yet here I was, finding reasons to spend time with two men who were nearly strangers. The thrill and guilt became a constant companion, battling inside me, each growing stronger with every passing day. One evening, a few weeks later, I found myself standing at their door. It was Malik who opened it, surprise flashing across his face before it melted into something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. He led me inside, and we ended up talking for hours. Time slipped away unnoticed until the night was well upon us. I can't remember the details of our conversation, only the way he looked at me, the intensity in his eyes. There was a moment, a brief, fragile moment, when I thought he might reach out, might break the thin barrier we'd kept intact all this time. But instead he smiled softly and walked me back to the door. "Good night, Miss Winslow," he murmured, his voice low, filled with something unspoken. And with that, he closed the door, leaving me standing on the porch, my heart racing, my mind filled with questions I couldn't begin to answer. Days slipped by, but my thoughts stayed rooted in that night on Malik's porch, his soft good night echoing long after I'd walked away. I couldn't escape the strange pull he and Darius had on me. Their presence had burrowed under my skin, lingering even when they weren't there, as if the air itself held their scent, their warmth. One night, I poured myself a glass of wine, letting it sit on the coffee table as I stared out the window. Hoping, waiting, my heart thudded when I finally saw movement across the street. Darius was leaning against his car, looking up at the sky. I don't know what came over me, but without a second thought, I slipped into my shoes and stepped outside, wine glass still in hand. "You look like you could use some company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, casual. Darius glanced over, a slow, easy grin spreading across his face. "And here I thought you'd forgotten about us," he replied, his tone teasing. "Not a chance," I said, and though I tried to keep it light, the words hung between us, dense and weighted. He tilted his head toward his house, an unspoken invitation. I followed him inside. Inside, the atmosphere was warmer, almost stifling. Darius led me into the kitchen, poured another glass of wine, and leaned against the counter, his eyes studying me. His gaze was intense, almost predatory, yet it didn't frighten me. In fact, I felt myself drawn in, as if some hidden part of me had been waiting for this, craving it. "Miss Winslow," he began, his voice trailing off, searching for the right words. "Celeste," I corrected him, a faint smile on my lips. He grinned, closing the space between us. "Celeste," he said, as if tasting the name for the first time. And then, without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. It was soft at first, a tentative kiss that left me breathless, my heart racing. But as his hand slid around my waist, pulling me closer, I found myself responding, losing myself in the forbidden thrill. It was wrong. Some part of me knew that. But in that moment, I didn't care. I was lost in the warmth of his touch, the taste of his kiss, the feeling of being wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally broke apart, his gaze was locked on mine, a silent understanding passing between us. Whatever boundaries we'd held on to had just been shattered. After that night, there was no going back. Our encounters became a regular occurrence, though always under the cover of darkness, away from the prying eyes of the neighborhood. Malik, too, began to linger around more often. His quiet presence, as magnetic as Darius's, was bold. The three of us would spend evenings together, drinking, talking, the tension between us simmering just below the surface. One night, Malik invited me out to the bar where he worked. I knew it was risky. Someone might see us, rumors might start. But the thrill of it outweighed my fears. I arrived early, finding a quiet corner where I could watch him work. Seeing him there, moving with practiced ease among the patrons, made him feel more real, more tangible. He spotted me after a while, a hint of a smile touching his lips as he leaned over the bar. "You look different outside of the neighborhood," he remarked, his tone low and intimate. I laughed softly. "So do you," I replied, realizing that the barriers between us were dissolving faster than I could rebuild them. By the end of the night, I found myself back at his place, his arms around me, his voice a quiet murmur in the dark. The thrill of those nights became a lifeline, an escape from the monotony of my days. I found myself thinking of them constantly, planning my days around the next encounter, the next stolen moment. They became an addiction, a secret that filled me with both excitement and dread. And yet, there was a darkness growing at the edges. Sometimes I would catch Darius and Malik exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. A subtle understanding passing between them. They had their own language, their own private jokes, and though I was part of their world, I was never fully in it. It was a fragile connection, one that could shatter at any moment. But that, too, was part of the thrill. Then, one evening, As I was leaving their house, I spotted Irene, my neighbor, watching from her window. My stomach dropped, a cold dread creeping through me. I managed a polite wave, hoping she hadn't seen too much, but the look in her eyes made it clear she'd noticed more than I wanted her to. I hurried home, anxiety gnawing at me, wondering what she might do with that information. Days passed, and I tried to push Irene's suspicious look out of my mind, but the anxiety lingered, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. I avoided her as best as I could, but every time I left the house, I felt her eyes on me, watching, judging. Then one evening I found a note on my front porch. It was simple, a single sentence written in a familiar looping script. "Be careful, Celeste. Secrets have a way of getting out." My heart pounded as I read the note, fear gripping me. Who had written it? Was it Irene? Or someone else who'd seen more than they should have? I looked around, but the street was empty, quiet, the world around me deceptively calm. I took the note inside, hiding it in a drawer, but the warning stayed with me. It was a reminder that I was playing a dangerous game, one that could unravel everything I'd built if I wasn't careful. Despite the note, despite the risk, I couldn't stop. I was in too deep, too entangled in the thrill, the excitement, the escape they offered me. But something had shifted. Darius and Malik were growing bolder, less careful. There were nights when they would show up at my house unannounced, leaving only moments before dawn, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else noticed. And then one evening, I found myself caught between them in a way I hadn't anticipated. Malik had invited me over, and as we sat together, laughing, drinking, Darius arrived, a smirk on his face, his eyes glinting with a challenge. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement, and suddenly I realized the power dynamics between us had shifted. I was no longer in control, if I ever had been. They held the reins, and I was at their mercy. That night, they both stayed, and I was left reeling, caught in a web of desire and fear, unable to escape. I'd crossed a line, one I couldn't retreat from, and the consequences loomed, dark and inevitable. The days after that night felt thick, heavy. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way Darius's laughter sometimes held an edge of mockery, or how Malik's gaze lingered just a bit too long, as if assessing rather than admiring. Perhaps I was only now seeing what had been there all along, or perhaps something had changed in them. It was a chill that started as a whisper in the back of my mind, one I tried to ignore, to rationalize. But the feeling grew, dark and invasive, and I found myself questioning everything. Had they been laughing at me all this time? Or was it just my own fears, twisting the truth? I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they let on, that they'd somehow been working together, pulling me in deeper for reasons I couldn't fathom. And yet, I kept seeing them. The addiction was too strong, the pull too magnetic. But with each encounter, that doubt gnawed at me, unsettling, inescapable. One evening, while Malik was at work, I stopped by Darius's house. He'd called me earlier, asking me to bring over some documents I'd offered to help him with for a potential job application. But when I arrived, he wasn't there. I almost turned around, but something compelled me to stay, to wait for him. Wandering through his living room, I noticed his laptop open on the coffee table. A sense of guilt crept over me as I sat down, but curiosity got the best of me. I clicked through the tabs open on his screen, expecting to find job applications or music files. Instead, I found a series of messages between him and Malik. The tone of their conversation sent a cold shock through me. They spoke of me, not in admiration, but with a strange mixture of amusement and strategy. Lines like, "Don't let her suspect anything yet," and "Make sure she thinks we're just playing along," leapt out at me, mocking the trust I'd so freely given them. I shut the laptop, my hands shaking. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing down, heavy and unrelenting. I'd been nothing more than a game to them, a diversion. My stomach twisted as I left the house, my thoughts racing. How long had they been planning this? And more terrifyingly, why? The next time I saw Darius, I struggled to maintain my composure. He greeted me as usual, his charm almost convincing. But now, everything about him felt insincere. I fought back the urge to confront him, to demand answers, but I knew better than to give him the satisfaction. I wasn't sure what they wanted from me, or what their endgame was, but I knew I had to be careful. The tension built up until one evening, unable to bear it any longer, I went to see Malik at the bar. It was late and I found him wiping down tables after closing. I didn't mince words. "Why are you doing this to me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He looked up, his face a mask of feigned innocence. "Doing what?" "Don't play coy," I spat, the anger rising in me. "I saw the messages. I know you and Darius have been planning something. I deserve to know why." For a moment his expression faltered, his gaze hardening, but then he let out a soft laugh, one that sent a chill through me. "You've got it all wrong, Celeste," he said, his voice calm. "We're not doing anything you didn't ask for." The words hung in the air, dense with implication. A cruel twist of reality I hadn't anticipated. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe you're just seeing what you want to see." With that he turned away, leaving me standing there, reeling from his words. My mind spun, confusion warring with fear. Had I been imagining things, or was he simply that good at manipulation? A few days later, I found another note at my door. This one wasn't written in Irene's careful script, but in messy, almost frantic handwriting. "They're using you," it said. "Get out before it's too late." My heart pounded as I scanned the street, but it was deserted. Who had left the note? A friend, or someone else watching from the shadows, who knew far more than they should. I thought about going to the police, but with what evidence? A few strange notes and vague conversations wouldn't amount to anything, and I couldn't risk drawing more attention to myself. Instead, I kept the note, tucked it away with the first, and tried to calm myself. But the warning stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind. The world I'd thought I controlled was unraveling, slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The next morning, Irene showed up at my door, unannounced, her face tight with worry. She held my gaze for a long moment before speaking. "Celeste, is there something going on with those boys?" she asked, her tone cautious. My instinct was to deny it, to brush her off, but the concern in her eyes made me hesitate. Irene wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was the closest thing I had to a friend, someone who'd known me before any of this had started. "I'm fine, Irene," I said, forcing a smile. "Really?" She looked unconvinced. "Just be careful," she said softly. "There's talk going around. People are starting to notice." Her words left me with a hollow feeling. I'd thought I was in control, thought I could keep my private life separate from the prying eyes of the neighborhood. But I was wrong. My reputation, my privacy, they were all crumbling around me, and I was powerless to stop it. One night, as I sat alone in my living room, there was a knock at the door. My heart raced, my thoughts spinning with dread. When I opened it, Darius stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes dark. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the house. I closed the door, feeling the walls close in as I followed him to the living room. He sat down, staring at me with a strange intensity. "You've been acting strange, Celeste," he began, his voice low. "I don't know what you think you saw, but it's not what you think." I could barely breathe, my mind racing with confusion and fear. "Then explain it to me," I whispered. "Tell me why you've been lying to me." A shadow of irritation flickered across his face. "I haven't lied," he replied, his voice hard. "You're the one who's been creating stories, looking for something that isn't there." The accusation stung, but before I could respond, Malik appeared in the doorway, his gaze cold, detached. He closed the door behind him, locking it with a soft click that sent a shiver down my spine. "Celeste," Malik said, his voice eerily calm, "it's time we had a talk." The two of them stood before me, their expressions unreadable, their intentions hidden behind the masks they wore so effortlessly. I was trapped, caught between them, my world crumbling under the weight of their betrayal. The next evening, as I sat at home trying to piece together my thoughts, my phone buzzed. A message from Darius. "Come over, it's urgent." The word sent a chill through me. Despite everything, some pull, a mixture of loyalty, fear, and maybe even love, drew me toward them. I couldn't say no. When I arrived, Malik was pacing in the dim light of their living room, his expression dark and furious. Darius was slumped in a chair, his face pale, his hands streaked with something dark. I stepped closer, horror clenching at my stomach as I realized it was blood. "What happened?" I whispered, my voice barely holding. Darius looked up, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name. "There was a situation," he said slowly, each word weighted. Malik shot him a warning glance, and Darius fell silent. Malik crossed the room, grabbing a towel and pressing it into Darius's hands, his expression cool, calculated. "We handled it, but things got messy," he explained, his tone void of emotion. "We need help covering this up, Celeste." My mind raced. I should have turned and left right then, but I was frozen, ensnared by the gravity of what lay before me. There was something they weren't telling me. Something hidden beneath Malik's cold facade and Darius's blood-streaked hands. But I didn't ask questions. I didn't want the answers. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of whispered instructions and hurried movements. They led me to the garage, where a dark stain on the concrete marked a confrontation gone wrong. My stomach twisted as I realized the enormity of what they were asking me to do. To help them cover up evidence, to dispose of traces that could lead back to them. "We have to stick together on this," Malik said, his voice low and commanding. He looked at me, his gaze piercing, as if he could see the hesitation bubbling up within me. "If anyone finds out, we're all implicated, Celeste, you too." A cold dread settled over me as his words sank in. I was trapped, bound to them by a thread that had frayed beyond repair. There was no turning back now, not without risking everything. Under Malik's direction, we scrubbed and cleaned, erasing any trace of what had happened. Every movement felt surreal, as if I were watching myself from a distance. But no matter how detached I tried to feel, a sickening weight clung to my chest. When it was over, I could barely look at them. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. I could still see the blood on Darius's hands, the cold detachment in Malik's eyes. I felt as though I were suffocating, drowning beneath the weight of what I'd done. Yet there was no escape. The fear, the paranoia, grew with each passing day. They'd made it clear, this was our secret to keep. But keeping it meant more than just silence. They made sure of that, drawing me in closer, keeping me entangled in their world with a careful mix of fear and twisted loyalty. Every time I tried to pull away, to regain some semblance of control, Malik reminded me of what was at stake. "You don't want people asking questions, Celeste," he would say with that quiet menace in his voice. "The police, your neighbors, they wouldn't understand." I felt trapped, a puppet caught in strings I couldn't cut. And though a part of me despised them for what they'd done, another part couldn't help but feel a strange, sick loyalty, a need to protect the fragile, dark connection we shared. A week later, as I was leaving my house, I found a folded piece of paper on my doorstep. The note was brief, written in the same frantic handwriting as before. "Leave them now, before it's too late." The message filled me with both dread and a faint, inexplicable hope. Someone knew. Someone understood the danger I was in, the trap I couldn't escape. I searched the street, hoping to catch sight of whoever had left it, but there was no one in sight. That evening, I confronted Malik, hoping to find some answers, some sliver of the truth I could cling to. But he only laughed, a hollow sound that chilled me to the core. "Secrets always have a way of finding you," he said, his tone mocking. "But don't worry, Celeste. You're too deep in this to get out now. His words were a death knell, a final nail in the coffin of my old life. I realized then that I wasn't a participant in their plans. I was their pawn, a disposable piece in whatever game they were playing. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The next day, Irene didn't show up for her usual morning walk. I dismissed it at first, telling myself she was probably busy or out of town. But as the days went by with no sign of her, my unease grew. When the police finally came around asking questions, I felt a surge of panic. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual, if I'd heard from her recently. My throat tightened as I answered, each word feeling like a betrayal. I hadn't told anyone about Irene's suspicions, about the quiet warnings she'd given me. But now, with her gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that her absence was somehow connected to Darius and Malik. They denied knowing anything when I confronted them, their expressions unreadable. But Malik's words, his cold, unfeeling eyes, left me with a sense of dread I couldn't ignore. "People disappear all the time, Celeste," he said, his voice flat. "You do well to remember that." My world unraveled in the weeks that followed. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, haunted by whispers and shadows, by the things I'd seen and the things I couldn't explain. I found myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound, convinced that Irene's absence was somehow my fault. Darius became more distant, his once charming demeanor slipping into something darker, more dangerous. Malik, on the other hand, grew possessive, watching my every move, his gaze cold and calculating. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, bound to them by the secret we shared, by the fear of what they might do if I tried to break free. One evening, as I was sitting alone in my living room, the phone rang. It was a blocked number, the voice on the other end distorted, unrecognizable. "Stay away from them," the voice warned, "before you end up like Irene." The line went dead, leaving me paralyzed with fear. Someone else knew. Someone was watching, waiting for me to make a move. I realized then that my life was no longer my own. I was caught in a web of deceit and danger, and there was no escape. Driven to the edge, I finally decided to confront Darius and Malik one last time. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next threat would strike. I needed answers, some form of closure, even if it meant risking everything. I found them in their living room, their faces shadowed in the dim light. They watched me with cold, calculating eyes, their expressions unreadable. "You used me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You lied to me, manipulated me, and now Irene's gone. What did you do to her?" For a moment, they were silent, exchanging a glance that sent a chill through me. Then Darius leaned forward, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his face. "You wanted to be a part of this, Celeste," he said, his voice low. "You wanted the thrill, the danger. Don't act like a victim now." Malik nodded, his gaze cold and unfeeling. "You're as guilty as we are. You wanted in. Now you're in." Their words shattered whatever illusions I'd held on to. I realized with a sinking dread that I had no one to blame but myself. I had stepped willingly into their world, craving the thrill, the escape, and now I was trapped, a prisoner of my own choices. As I turned to leave, Malik grabbed my arm, his grip firm, unyielding. "Don't think you can just walk away, Celeste," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet menace. "You're in this for good now, and if you so much as breathe a word of this to anyone, you'll end up just like Irene." His words echoed in my mind as I walked away, feeling the weight of my own decisions pressing down on me. I had walked willingly into their world, and now there was no way out. In the days that followed my last confrontation with Darius and Malik, a crushing sense of dread settled over me. The walls of my own home seemed to close in, thick with the memories of everything I'd done and the secrets I'd buried. Every shadow held a threat. Every creak in the house felt like an accusation. Sleep became a distant luxury. Even in my dreams, I saw their faces, their cold, mocking smiles, their unspoken threats. I tried to go about my days as if everything were normal. I went to the grocery store, exchanged polite nods with neighbors, but nothing felt real anymore. My mind was trapped, spinning in an endless cycle of fear and regret. I knew that if I stayed here, if I stayed tied to them, I would lose what was left of myself. One night, I gathered what courage I had left and dialed the police. My hands shook as the phone rang, my mind racing with what I would tell them, what I could possibly say that would convey the depth of the nightmare I was living. But when a voice answered on the other end, I froze. The words I'd practiced disappeared, replaced by a suffocating fear. And then I heard the click. The line went dead. I glanced around the empty room, a chill creeping up my spine. Malik's warning replayed in my mind, a constant echo I couldn't escape. You'll end up just like Irene. They were everywhere, watching, listening. There was no one I could trust, not even myself. The following evening, Malik showed up at my door, uninvited, his eyes cold and unfeeling. He stepped inside without a word, brushing past me with an air of control that left me breathless, trapped. I could see it in his gaze, the quiet satisfaction that he held all the power. "We need to talk, Celeste," he said, his tone soft, almost soothing, as if he were doing me a favor. "Things have gotten complicated." I tried to keep my composure, but the fear was clawing at me, relentless and consuming. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice cracking. He leaned closer, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "What I want, Celeste, is for you to remember your place. You wanted to be part of this, to feel something real." He paused, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "And now you're in. For good." The threat was clear, but there was something else in his eyes, a darkness that went deeper than I'd imagined. I realized, with a sickening dread, that he had no intention of letting me go. I was a pawn in his game, a tool to be used and discarded, and he was enjoying every moment of it. That night, I packed a small bag, my heart pounding as I stuffed the essentials into it. I didn't know where I was going or how far I could get, but I knew that staying here, bound to Malik and Darius, was a death sentence. They had taken everything from me, my freedom, my sense of self, and I had nothing left to lose. I waited until the early hours of the morning when the neighborhood was silent, cloaked in shadows. But as I opened the door, a figure stepped out of the darkness. Darius stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes a mixture of anger and something darker. "Going somewhere, Celeste?" His tone was mocking, taunting. He stepped closer, blocking my path, his gaze piercing. "You really thought you could just walk away?" Panic surged through me, a desperate animalistic urge to escape. I tried to push past him, but his grip was iron, his strength overpowering. He dragged me back into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. "We're not done with you yet," he hissed, his voice filled with a quiet menace that left no room for hope. Not even close. The following days were a blur of confinement and control. Malik and Darius took turns visiting, watching me, ensuring I didn't try to escape again. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. I was trapped, every door locked, every window closed. Then, one evening, Malik arrived with a manila envelope in hand, his expression twisted with a cruel satisfaction. He laid the envelope on the table, sliding it toward me with a cold, deliberate motion. "Open it," he ordered. I hesitated, fear pulsing through me as I reached for the envelope. Inside were photos, pictures of me with them, at my home, at the bar, even in places I didn't remember. Each image was a carefully crafted weapon, evidence of the life I'd tried to keep hidden. "You don't want these to get out, do you?" Malik's voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes held a predatory gleam. "All it takes is one phone call, and your reputation, your entire life, will be over." I stared at the photos, my hands trembling. He had trapped me, caged me in a web of blackmail and fear, and there was nothing I could do to escape. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, crushing, suffocating. He held my life in his hands, and he wasn't going to let it go. Desperation clawed at me, filling my mind with frantic thoughts, half-formed plans of escape. I couldn't live like this, trapped in Malik and Darius's twisted game, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next threat. I knew there was only one way out, and it wasn't through escape. That night, as they both sat in my living room, laughing, sharing a drink, I made my move. I grabbed the heavy candlestick from the mantel, my hands steady, my mind cold and clear. I'd reached the end of my rope, my will to survive overriding every other instinct. I struck first, the blow catching Darius by surprise, the sickening crack echoing through the room. Malik turned, a look of shock and fury flashing across his face, but I didn't stop. I struck again and again, until the room was silent, until the shadows finally closed in around me. I don't remember what happened after that. The police came, their questions blurring together, the lights too bright, too cold. I was a shell, empty, hollow, my mind fractured by the weight of everything I'd done, everything I'd become. They told me I'd acted in self-defense, that I was the victim, but the truth was far darker than that. I had allowed myself to be pulled into their world, had sacrificed everything to feel something real, something dangerous, and now there was nothing left. As I sat in the cold, sterile room, I realized that I had lost everything. My freedom, my dignity, my soul. And though I'd escaped their control, I was still trapped, a prisoner of my own choices, haunted by the darkness that had consumed me. I didn't mean to look, I swear, but the door swung open before I realized, and there he was, dripping wet, no towel in sight, and everything on display. My heart raced. I should have shut the door and walked away, but I froze. And then he looked at me. I'm Evelyn. I'm 54 years old, a paralegal by trade, and recently remarried to a wonderful man named Douglas. At least that's what everyone thinks. My friends at the firm envy me. You got lucky twice, they say. And I nod along, smiling like I have it all figured out. Truthfully, my second marriage has been a mix of comfort and distance. Douglas works long hours running his construction company, and when he's home, he's more interested in reruns of old westerns than in me. But this story isn't about Douglas. It's about his son, Ryan. Ryan moved back into our house 6 weeks ago after graduating from college. He's 23, tall, lean, but muscular, with dark hair that always looks a little messy no matter how much he combs it. He's polite, quiet, and keeps to himself most of the time, which I appreciated. Until that morning. I was half asleep, fumbling for coffee in the kitchen, when I remembered the towels. I'd put the last load in the dryer the night before, and forgotten to take them out. I grabbed a stack and headed down the hall to the bathroom, assuming Ryan had already left for his morning jog. But when I opened the door, I saw him. The steam from the shower clung to the air, and the glass door was fogged over, but not enough to hide him. He had just stepped out, water glistening on his skin, droplets sliding down his chest and over the sharp lines of his stomach. He didn't even flinch when he saw me standing there. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and steady. My brain screamed at me to look away, to say something, anything, but I couldn't move. My eyes betrayed me, lingering longer than they should have. He reached for the towel rack, but it was empty. That's when I realized the towels I was holding were for him. "Sorry," I stammered, thrusting the stack of towels toward him without meeting his gaze. "I didn't think anyone was in here." He stepped closer, taking the towels from me. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, mingling with the damp air. "No problem," he said, his tone calm, almost amused. "But you might want to knock next time." I turned and left the bathroom as quickly as I could, but my cheeks burned the rest of the day. That should have been the end of it. A simple mistake, an awkward moment we'd both laugh about later. But it wasn't. Because after that morning, things between us changed. Subtle at first. A glance that lingered too long, a casual touch that felt anything but accidental. And before I knew it, I was thinking about Ryan in ways I shouldn't. I'm not proud of what happened next, but I'm not going to lie about it either. Let me tell you how it all began. When I shut the door behind me, I leaned against it for a moment, clutching the stack of towels to my chest, as if they could somehow shield me from the guilt spreading through me like wildfire. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might echo through the hallway. What the hell just happened? I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing but a mortifying accident. I'd walked in, he'd seen me, I'd seen him. End of story. But my thoughts wouldn't stop looping back to the way his voice had sounded, low and steady, like he wasn't even fazed by the situation. And those eyes, dark, intense, and locked on mine the entire time. I forced myself to focus on mundane tasks for the rest of the morning, unloading the dishwasher, folding laundry, even scrubbing the stovetop like it owed me money. But every so often my mind would wander back to the bathroom, to the way Ryan's body had looked, the way he had stood there so calmly. By the time I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, my nerves were shot. Ryan appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, freshly dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp and curling slightly at the edges. "Morning," he said casually, grabbing a mug and pouring himself a cup of coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes firmly on the counter as I wiped it down. There was a silence between us, not exactly awkward, but charged. I could feel him watching me, and it took everything in me not to look up. Finally, he broke the tension. "Thanks for the towels earlier," he said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. My cheeks flushed, and I waved it off like it was nothing. "Oh sure, no problem. Just, next time, maybe lock the door?" "Fair enough," he said, his tone light, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression. Something amused, maybe even teasing. I spent the rest of the day avoiding him. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was just embarrassed and reading too much into things. But that night, as I sat in the living room pretending to watch TV, Ryan walked past me on his way to the kitchen, and I caught the faintest hint of a smile as he glanced in my direction. The next few days were strange, to say the least. Ryan and I fell into a rhythm of carefully polite conversations and stolen glances. It was subtle, but I felt it. The shift. He lingered in rooms longer than necessary, finding excuses to talk to me or ask for my help with things he didn't really need help with. One afternoon, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I heard him come in behind me. I didn't turn around, but I could feel him there, close enough that I could sense his presence without seeing him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice softer than usual. I turned off the water and dried my hands, finally turning to face him. "Yeah?" "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes meeting mine. My stomach twisted. "About what?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the floor for a moment before coming back to mine. "About what happened the other day, in the bathroom." I froze, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "It was an accident," I said quickly. "Let's just forget about it." He stepped closer, and my pulse quickened. "I'm not sure I can." "Ryan," I began, but he cut me off. "You looked at me, Evelyn," he said, his tone steady but his eyes burning with intensity. "And I saw the way you looked at me." I started to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. "I'm not trying to make this weird," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "But I can't stop thinking about you." The air between us felt thick, heavy. I wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at him, my heart hammering in my chest. "I think you should go," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded, his jaw tightening, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue. But then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat ringing in my ears. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. The way he had looked at me, the way his voice had sounded when he said he couldn't stop thinking about me. It was wrong. All of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it out of my mind. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with him. His voice, his touch, his eyes. I woke up in a tangle of sheets, my heart racing, and I knew I was in trouble. Because as much as I wanted to deny it, a part of me felt the same way. The days that followed were a blur of tension, and the house felt smaller than ever. Every glance, every moment alone with Ryan seemed to stretch time, as if the universe itself wanted to magnify the space we now occupied together. I told myself it would pass, that things would settle back to normal, but deep down, I knew better. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first real crack in my resolve appeared. I had just come back from the grocery store, bags in hand, when Ryan came downstairs. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and athletic shorts, the kind that hung just loosely enough to be distracting. His hair was damp, as though he'd just showered, and the sight made my pulse quicken. "Need help with those?" he asked, gesturing to the bags. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, trying to avoid eye contact. But Ryan ignored me and grabbed a couple of bags anyway, brushing past me as he headed toward the kitchen. It was such a small thing, really, but the casual way his arm grazed mine sent a shiver down my spine. As we unpacked the groceries together, the silence between us felt almost oppressive. I could feel his eyes on me, and every movement, every breath felt deliberate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Ryan," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He stopped mid-motion, a box of cereal in his hand. "Yeah?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure of what I wanted to say. "You've been different lately." He set the box down on the counter and turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. "Different how?" "You know how," I said, crossing my arms in front of me like a shield. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. Then slowly, he stepped closer. "Do I make you uncomfortable?" he asked, his voice low. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. He was too close now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw. "Because I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "But I don't think that's what's happening here." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Ryan, this has to stop," I said, my voice trembling. "Why?" he asked, his tones soft but unyielding. "Because it's wrong," I said, trying to muster some kind of authority. "Is it?" he countered, his voice dropping even lower. "Or are you just scared of how it makes you feel?" I stared at him, my mind spinning. How was he so calm, so sure of himself, when I felt like my entire world was teetering on the edge of collapse? Before I could respond, he stepped back, breaking the tension. "Okay," he said simply. "I'll back off, if that's what you really want." Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my heart racing and my resolve crumbling. The rest of the week passed in a haze of avoidance. I buried myself in work, volunteering to take on extra cases at the office just to stay out of the house. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the thoughts that kept creeping in. The way Ryan had looked at me, the way his voice had sounded, it was like he had planted something inside me, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One night, after Douglas had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, staring blankly at the television. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear Ryan come in until he was standing right behind me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. I turned to look at him, and my breath caught in my throat. He was wearing a fitted t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy like he had just rolled out of bed. "Something like that," I said, trying to sound casual. He moved around the couch and sat down next to me, too close for comfort. I should have gotten up, should have made some excuse to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed right where I was, my pulse quickening as his presence filled the space around me. "You've been avoiding me," he said after a moment, his tone matter-of-fact. I laughed nervously. "I've been busy." "Is that what you're telling yourself?" he asked, his voice laced with a quiet intensity that made my stomach twist. I turned to face him, and for a moment we just stared at each other. The air between us felt charged, like a storm about to break. I wanted to say something, to tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. And then, before I knew what was happening, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch was so light, so fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Evelyn," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I closed my eyes, willing myself to pull away, to end this before it went any further. But when I opened them again, he was still there, his hand lingering just inches from my face, his eyes searching mine for some kind of permission. And in that moment, I knew I was lost. That night marked the beginning of something I couldn't take back. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back now. But what I didn't know then was just how far it would go, and how much it would cost me. I had always imagined that crossing a line like this would feel like a sharp, decisive moment. A clean break from one reality into another. But it wasn't like that. It was subtle, gradual, like slipping into warm water before realizing it's scalding hot. The night Ryan touched my face, we didn't say another word. He didn't push further, didn't try to kiss me. He just stayed there, his hand brushing against my cheek for a moment longer before he stood and left the room. But that single moment changed everything. The days that followed were unbearable. The tension between us had gone from a slow simmer to a rolling boil. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand against mine felt electric, like a secret we were both carrying but couldn't acknowledge out loud. I tried to distract myself with work, errands, even pointless chores around the house, but it didn't help. Then, one night, it happened. It was late, close to midnight, and the house was dark and quiet. Douglas was snoring in the bedroom, oblivious as always. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. Ryan was there. He was standing by the sink, shirtless, drinking from a water bottle. The light from the refrigerator cast a soft glow across his chest, highlighting every line and shadow. He turned when he heard me, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I said, my throat dry. I moved toward the sink, intending to fill my glass, but as I passed him, his hand brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, barely a touch, but it made me stop. I turned to look at him, and the look in his eyes made my heart skip a beat. "Evelyn," he said softly, taking a step closer. I froze, my mind screaming at me to walk away, to go back upstairs to bed and pretend this never happened. But my feet wouldn't move. "I know this is wrong," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I can't stop thinking about you." "Ryan," I began, but he cut me off. "No," he said, his tone more firm. "I need to say this. I need you to know how I feel." I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he continued, "but I can't pretend anymore. I care about you, Evelyn, more than I should." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and charged. "This can't happen," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Why not?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's wrong? Or because you're scared?" I didn't have an answer for him. Or maybe I did, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. He stepped closer, so close I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his skin. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Tell me to walk away, and I will." I opened my mouth to tell him exactly that, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, my chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. And then, he kissed me. The moment his lips touched mine, something inside me broke. I should have pushed him away, should have stopped it before it went any further, but I didn't. I kissed him back, my hands finding their way to his chest, his shoulders, pulling him closer. It was reckless, impulsive, and completely out of character for me. But in that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was the way his hands felt on my skin, the way his lips moved against mine, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He guided me toward the counter, his hands firm but gentle as he lifted me onto it. My mind was a blur of sensations, his touch, his scent, the warmth of his breath against my neck. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and husky. I nodded, unable to form coherent words. The rest of the night was a haze of stolen touches and whispered words, a whirlwind of passion that left me breathless and reeling. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, that the weight of what I had done truly hit me. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a choice that would change everything, and as much as I hated myself for it, a part of me couldn't bring myself to regret it. Because for the first time in years, I felt something. Something real, something raw, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, I knew this was just the beginning. That morning, I avoided Ryan as best I could. I stayed in my room until I heard him leave for his morning jog, then rushed downstairs to make coffee and busy myself with anything that would keep my mind off him. But when he came back, sweaty and flushed from his run, and gave me that look, the one that said he knew exactly what we'd done and wasn't sorry for it, I knew I was in trouble. Because no matter how wrong it was, no matter how much I tried to convince myself to stop, I didn't want it to end. Not yet. If I thought things would go back to normal, I was kidding myself. The morning after our first kiss, and everything else that followed, Ryan and I fell into an unspoken understanding. We didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it out loud, but the shift was palpable. It was in the way he lingered in the kitchen while I made coffee, brushing his hand against mine as he reached for a mug. It was in the way he looked at me across the living room when we were all sitting together as a family, his gaze heavy with meaning. Douglas, blissfully oblivious, went about his usual routines, working late and falling asleep in front of the TV. He never noticed the stolen moments, the shared glances, the growing tension that seemed to hum in the air whenever Ryan and I were in the same room. It was a week later when Ryan made the first move to take things further. I was in my office upstairs going over some legal documents for work. The house was quiet. Douglas was at a client dinner, and Ryan had been out all day. Or so I thought. I didn't hear him come in until he was standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Busy?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with that familiar undercurrent of something more. I looked up, startled. "Just finishing up," I said, my tone more clipped than I intended. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Ryan, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper as he crossed the room toward me. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said simply, his eyes locking onto mine. I stood up, my heart racing. "This isn't a good idea." "Maybe not," he said, closing the gap between us, "but that doesn't mean we don't both want it." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. The touch was so gentle, so deliberate, that it made my resolve crumble. "Ryan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't say anything, just leaned in and kissed me. It was slower this time, more controlled but no less intense. My hands found their way to his chest, his shoulders, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened. He guided me back against the desk, his hands firm but careful as they explored the curves of my body. It was reckless, impulsive, and completely wrong. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. Over the next few weeks, our affair became a carefully orchestrated game of secrecy. We found ways to steal moments together whenever we could. One afternoon, when Douglas was out on a work trip, Ryan cornered me in the kitchen. I had been slicing vegetables for dinner when he came up behind me, his hands resting on my hips as he leaned in close. "You smell amazing," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. I froze, my pulse quickening. "Ryan, not here," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "No one's home," he said, his voice low and full of confidence. Before I could argue, he spun me around, his lips capturing mine in a heated kiss. I melted into him, the knife and cutting board forgotten as his hands roamed my body, pulling me closer. Then there was the night in the living room. Douglas had fallen asleep in his recliner, the volume on the TV turned down low. Ryan and I sat at opposite ends of the couch, pretending to watch a movie. But his foot brushed against mine under the coffee table, and when I glanced over, his eyes were fixed on me with that same smoldering intensity. As Douglas snored softly, Ryan leaned over, his hand lightly grazing my knee. I shot him a warning look, but he didn't stop. His fingers trailed upward, leaving a trail of goosebumps in their wake. My breath hitched, and I had to bite my lip to keep from gasping. "Stop," I mouthed silently, but he just smirked, his hand lingering for a moment longer before he pulled away. The affair was exhilarating, intoxicating, and completely consuming. But it wasn't without its challenges. One evening, as I sat in the bedroom folding laundry, Ryan walked in, his expression serious. "Evelyn, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Camille's coming over tomorrow," he said, referring to his on-again, off-again college girlfriend. I stiffened. "Why?" "She wants to talk," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I think she knows something's up." "Ryan, this is dangerous," I said, my voice rising slightly. "If she suspects anything." "She doesn't know," he said quickly, "but I can tell she's suspicious." My heart sank. Camille had always struck me as perceptive, and the idea of her poking around made me nervous. "Just be careful," I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't as confident as he wanted me to believe. The next day, I made myself scarce, retreating to my office while Camille visited. I could hear their voices drifting up from the living room, the occasional laugh or raised tone. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering, wondering what they were talking about, whether she was prying into things she shouldn't. When she finally left, I waited a few minutes before heading downstairs. Ryan was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting down next to him. He looked up at me, his expression torn. "She's suspicious," he admitted. "What did she say?" "She asked a lot of questions," he said, shaking his head. "About you. About us. She thinks I'm hiding something." My stomach churned. "Ryan, we need to be more careful." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I can't stop. I don't want to stop." I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Neither do I admitted. As much as we tried to keep things under control, the cracks were starting to show. Camille's suspicions were growing, and I could sense that Douglas was beginning to pick up on the tension in the house. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Douglas glanced between me and Ryan, his brow furrowing. "Is something going on between you two?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual but probing. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing a laugh. "You've been acting different," he said, his gaze narrowing. Ryan shrugged. "Playing it off?" "Just busy, I guess." Douglas didn't look convinced, but he let it go, for now. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. The thrill of the affair was starting to give way to the weight of its consequences, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to stop, because no matter how wrong it was, no matter how high the stakes, I wasn't ready to let Ryan go. Not yet. I woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. It was just past 7 in the morning, and the house was unusually lively for such an early hour. As I sat up in bed, I recognized one of the voices. It was Camille. She was back. A wave of anxiety hit me as I threw on a robe and headed toward the door. The tension between Ryan and Camille had been building for weeks, and I dreaded what might happen if she had decided to confront him about us, or worse, if she had decided to confront me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. "You've been so distant, Ryan," Camille was saying, her voice sharp but tinged with hurt. "I feel like I'm the only one trying to make this work." "I've just been busy," Ryan replied, his tone calm but defensive. "Busy with what?" she shot back. "You've been home all summer. You're not working, you're not taking summer classes. So what's keeping you so occupied that you can't even answer my texts half the time?" There was a long pause, and I held my breath, waiting for Ryan's response. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice quieter. "Then what is it?" Camille demanded. "Because I know you're hiding something, Ryan. I can feel it." I couldn't listen anymore. My hands were shaking as I made my way back to my room, shutting the door quietly behind me. The rest of the day was tense. Camille stayed for hours, following Ryan around like a shadow. I kept to myself, retreating to my office or busying myself in the kitchen to avoid her. But every time I heard her laugh or caught a glimpse of her hand on Ryan's arm, a knot of jealousy tightened in my chest. By the time she finally left, it was almost evening. I waited a few minutes before heading downstairs, where I found Ryan in the living room, pacing. "What happened?" I asked, my voice low. "She's suspicious," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't know for sure, but she's not letting this go." I sat down on the couch, my mind racing. "Ryan, we have to be more careful. If she finds out—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice sharp. Then he sighed and sat down next to me, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to do, Evelyn. I don't want to lose you, but I feel like everything's closing in on us." I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The first real crack came 2 days later. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I heard the sound of my phone buzzing on the counter. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from Camille. "We need to talk. Call me." My heart dropped. I quickly deleted the message, but my hands were shaking as I returned to my chopping. Why would Camille be texting me? Did she know? That evening, after Douglas had gone to bed, I confronted Ryan. "Camille texted me today," I said, my voice trembling. His eyes widened. What did she say?" She wants to talk, I said. Ryan, I think she knows. She doesn't know, he said quickly, but his voice wavered. She's probably just fishing for something. What if she's not? I pressed. What if she's already figured it out? Ryan, this could ruin everything. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression torn. I'll talk to her, he said finally. I'll make her back off. Ryan, you can't just talk your way out of this, I said. She's not stupid. I'll handle it, he said, his tone more forceful this time. But I wasn't convinced. The confrontation I had been dreading finally came 2 days later. Camille showed up unannounced, catching me off guard as I was leaving for a meeting. Evelyn, she said, her tone cool but pointed. Camille, I said, forcing a smile. What brings you by? We need to talk, she said, crossing her arms over her chest. And I think you know what this is about. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. I'm not sure I do, I said, hoping to buy myself some time. Her eyes narrowed. I know something's going on between you and Ryan, she said bluntly. My heart stopped. I've seen the way you look at each other, she continued, her voice rising. The way he acts around you. Do you really think I wouldn't notice? Camille, you're mistaken, I said quickly, but my voice wavered, betraying me. Am I? She shot back, stepping closer. Because I don't think I am, and unless you want me to go to Douglas with this, you'd better start talking. I stared at her, my mind racing. I could deny it, try to convince her she was wrong, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't going to let this go. What do you want? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. A slow smile spread across her face, but there was no warmth in it. For starters, I want you to end whatever this is, she said. And then I want you to tell Ryan to stop avoiding me. If you don't, I'll tell Douglas everything. I nodded, my throat tightening. Okay, I said, I'll talk to him. You'd better, she said, her tone sharp. Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my hands shaking and my stomach in knots. That night, I told Ryan everything. She's blackmailing me, I said, my voice trembling. She's going to tell Douglas if we don't stop. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then he stood up, pacing the room. We can't let her control us, he said finally. Ryan, she has all the power right now, I said. If she tells Douglas, she won't, he said, cutting me off. I won't let her. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't as confident as he wanted me to believe. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the unraveling. Camille's ultimatum hung over us like a storm cloud, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt completely powerless. Ryan, for all his confidence and determination, couldn't stop the inevitable. She was a threat we couldn't contain. I spent the next few days in a haze of dread, trying to act normal around Douglas, while also navigating the suffocating tension between Ryan and me. Camille hadn't contacted me again, but that didn't bring any comfort. I knew she was calculating her next move, and I was running out of ways to stay ahead of her. Then, everything came crashing down in a way I never could have predicted. It was a Saturday night. Douglas had invited his brother Keith over for dinner, and the house was unusually lively. Keith was loud, charismatic, and drank more than he should have. I spent most of the evening forcing smiles and refilling glasses while keeping my distance from Ryan, who sat quietly at the end of the table, his jaw clenched as Keith's booming laughter filled the room. Halfway through dinner, Camille showed up unannounced. The doorbell rang, and my heart dropped. Douglas stood up to answer it, and when I heard her voice in the hallway, I froze. What's she doing here? Ryan hissed, leaning toward me across the table. I don't know, I whispered, panic setting in. Camille walked into the dining room with her usual confidence, her smile wide and fake. Sorry for dropping by uninvited, she said sweetly, but I just had to see Ryan. Douglas, oblivious as ever, welcomed her with open arms. Of course. Grab a plate. We've got plenty of food. Ryan shot me a look that was equal parts anger and fear. I shook my head slightly, silently begging him to keep his cool. Camille sat down next to Ryan, her presence suffocating. She leaned in close to him, whispering something in his ear that made his jaw tighten. I couldn't hear what she said, but I didn't need to. The smug look on her face told me everything I needed to know. After dinner, while Douglas and Keith were in the living room laughing over old family stories, Camille cornered me in the kitchen. "Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I turned to face her, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What do you want, Camille?" She smirked, crossing her arms over her chest. "I just thought you should know. I'm done playing nice." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means I'm telling Douglas," she said, her smile widening. "Unless, of course, you'd like to make me a better offer." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What do you want?" She tilted her head, pretending to think. "For starters, I want Ryan back, and I want you out of the picture." "That's not going to happen," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Then I guess Douglas is going to find out about your little affair," she said, her tone almost gleeful. Before I could respond, Ryan walked into the kitchen. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes darting between us. "Nothing," Camille said, her smile returning. "Just a friendly chat." But the look she gave me as she walked past said otherwise. That night, after everyone had left, Ryan and I sat in the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do. "She's going to ruin everything," I said, my voice shaking. "Maybe not," Ryan said, his tone thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we can beat her to it," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "If we come clean to Douglas before she does, we control the narrative," he said. "We can spin it in a way that makes her look like the villain." "Ryan, that's insane," I said. "You think he's going to forgive us just because we told him first?" "No," he admitted. "But at least we won't be blindsided when she tries to blow everything up." I stared at him, my mind spinning. It was a bold plan, and it might work, but it also might destroy us completely. Before we could decide on a course of action, everything spiraled out of control. 2 days later, I received an email at work. The subject line read, "You should know." When I opened it, my blood turned to ice. It was from Camille. Attached were several photos of Ryan and me together. Kissing, touching, laughing, each one more damning than the last. The message was simple: "Tell Douglas, or I will." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I had no idea how she'd gotten the photos. Maybe she'd followed us, or maybe Ryan had been careless with his phone. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she had everything she needed to destroy us. That night, I showed Ryan the email. "She's not bluffing," he said, his voice tight with anger. "What do we do?" I asked, panic setting in. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he paced the room, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. Finally, he stopped and turned to me. "We end it," he said. I stared at him, my heart sinking. "What?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "We end it. That's the only way to stop her." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. "Ryan, no," I said, my voice breaking. "We can't. We don't have a choice," he said, his tone firm. "If we don't stop, she'll destroy us both." Tears filled my eyes, but I nodded. He was right. We didn't have a choice. The next day, I sent Camille a message. "It's over. You win." Her response came almost immediately. "Smart choice." But as I sat there staring at her message, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Because secrets like ours don't just disappear. They linger, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. And deep down, I knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. For a few days, everything felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. Ryan and I avoided each other, even when we were alone in the house. Camille hadn't reached out again since my message, and Douglas seemed oblivious as ever, lost in his world of work and nightly TV reruns. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Every time I walked into a room, I half expected Camille to jump out from the shadows with new evidence, or for Douglas to confront me with questions I couldn't answer. The weight of waiting was unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the fragile peace shattered. And then it did. It happened during what should have been an ordinary family dinner. Douglas, Ryan, and I sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and the faint hum of conversation filling the air. Everything was perfectly normal, almost painfully so. Until Douglas set his fork down and cleared his throat. "I got an interesting email today," he said, his tone casual, but laced with something darker. My stomach dropped. Ryan froze, his hand gripping his water glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "What kind of email?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Douglas leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "From someone named Camille," he said. "She sent me some Photos. The room went silent. I felt like the walls were closing in around me, the air too thick to breathe. Photos of what? Ryan asked, his voice calm but strained. Douglas's gaze shifted to him, his jaw tightening. Of you and Evelyn. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Douglas, I can explain, I began, but he cut me off. Explain what, Evelyn? He snapped, his voice rising. Explain how you've been sneaking around behind my back with my son? Dad, it's not what you think. Ryan started, but Douglas slammed his hand on the table, cutting him off. Don't you dare, he said, his voice trembling with anger. Don't you dare try to defend this. The room was so tense it felt like it might break apart. I could see the betrayal in Douglas's eyes, the way his face flushed red with fury. How long? He demanded, his gaze swinging back to me. How long has this been going on? I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. What could I say? That it was a mistake? That I hadn't meant for it to happen? None of it would matter. Douglas, please, I said, my voice breaking. I'm sorry. Sorry? He repeated, his voice dripping with venom. You're sorry? You destroyed this family, Evelyn. Do you even understand what you've done? The argument escalated quickly after that. Douglas yelled, Ryan tried to interject, and I could barely keep up with the barrage of accusations and insults being hurled across the table. At one point, Douglas stood up, his hands balled into fists as he loomed over Ryan. You're supposed to be my son, he shouted. How could you do this to me? Ryan stood his ground, his voice steady but defiant. You were never around, Dad. You don't even see her. You don't see anything. That doesn't give you the right to. Douglas stopped mid-sentence, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't even look at either of you right now. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. For a moment, Ryan and I just stood there in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. This is my fault, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. No, Ryan said, his tone firm. We both made this choice. But look at what it's done, I said, tears streaming down my face. We've ruined everything. Ryan reached for me, his hand brushing against mine, but I pulled away. Don't, I said, my voice breaking. This has to stop, Ryan. For real this time. Evelyn, no, I said, cutting him off. It's over. It has to be. The days that followed were a blur of tension and heartbreak. Douglas avoided me completely, barely speaking to me except for curt, one-word responses. He spent most of his time in his office or out of the house, and when he was home, the silence between us was deafening. Ryan stayed in his room, leaving only when he absolutely had to. I could tell he was struggling, the weight of everything pressing down on him just as heavily as it was on me. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received another email. It was from Camille again, but this time, she wasn't threatening me. She was threatening Ryan. The email was short and to the point. You think this is over? Think again. If Ryan doesn't break things off with you for good, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person he is. His professors, his future employers, everyone. I'll destroy him, Evelyn. You know I can. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I had thought Camille was satisfied with breaking up our family, but I had underestimated her. She wasn't just vengeful. She was ruthless. I knew I couldn't let her follow through on her threat. I couldn't let her ruin Ryan's life, no matter how much pain it caused me. That night, I made a decision. I went to Ryan's room, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was about to do. He opened the door, his expression softening when he saw me. Evelyn, he said, stepping aside to let me in. I shook my head. We need to talk, I said, my voice trembling. He frowned, sensing the seriousness in my tone. What is it? I got another email from Camille, I said. She's threatening you now, your future, your career, everything. Ryan's jaw tightened. She can't do that. She can, I said, and she will. Ryan, I can't let that happen. I won't. So what are you saying? He asked, his voice heavy with dread. I'm saying this is over, I said, my voice breaking. For good this time. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. You don't mean that? I do, I said, tears streaming down my face. I love you, Ryan. But it's too much. It's hurting everyone. It's hurting you. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his shoulders slumping as the weight of my words sank in. Please, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Let me go. When I left his room that night, I knew I had made the right choice. But that didn't make it any less painful. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. I had lost everything. My marriage, my family, and now Ryan. But I also knew that this was the only way to pick up the pieces. If there were any pieces left to pick up at all,